In 1977, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published her book On Death and Dying. That was the title. And in On Death and Dying, she outlines the stages of the psychological, emotional stages of dying and of grief. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. For the longest time, this was the model of grief. And everyone believed that it was this straight linear progression through those 5 stages. First denial, then anger, then third bargaining, fourth depression, fifth acceptance. And once you got to that 5th stage, you were done. Now, in the field of psychology and psychiatry, this understanding was not outside the realm of the norm. With all the previous stages that came before, Freud's psychosexual development stages, Erikson's psychosocial stages, Piaget's stages of cognitive development, every stage had a first and then this one and then this one and then this one. However, with the psychodynamic stages, like Freud's, Erikson's, and others, failure to resolve a conflict or a crisis in an earlier stage would show up in later stages. For example, if one smoked or overate, Freud would argue that that person was fixated in the oral stage of development, which you see in infancy. Erikson proposed that trust issues that show up in young adulthood result from failure to resolve a trust versus mistrust crisis in infancy, usually related to unreliable or inconsistent caregiving. So, given that, it makes pretty logical sense that folks would understand Kubler-Ross's stages of grief and the grieving process to be linear. In around the early to mid 90s, she came back and said, no, that's not what I meant. That's not the way this works. You can start in denial. That's when you find out you have a bad medical diagnosis and you're like, no, what can we do? We can figure out some way to fix this. And then you might go to depression. And then you can bounce back to anger, go back to depression, come back to bargaining. You can bounce between stages. You can revisit stages. It's anything but a linear process. Now, we do have other understandings of grief and what grief looks like across the lifespan that go beyond Kubler-Ross's theories, but her ideas are still very solid for dealing with any kind of grief, any loss, any changes, stuff like that. And so I wanted to give you an introduction to her because one of the things there's one stage that we don't talk about a whole lot, that we don't want to acknowledge, and that we don't deal with very well. And that makes the already hard process of grieving way harder and way more complex. And I'll tell you what that is in my next video.